Well, at least 32 people are dead and dozens more wounded in a mass shooting in Afghanistan's capital of Kabul. The Islamic State has claimed responsibility for the attack. It took place at a Shia rally featuring prominent Afghan politicians, including opposition leader Abdullah. A news network captured the moment when the gunfire began in the middle of a speech. After opening fire, the two gunmen began a 5-hour-long standoff before eventually being killed by Afghan security forces. The attack is the deadliest in Kabul in months, and it comes at a politically tense time in Afghanistan. Well, the country's dealing with the fallout of last month's disputed presidential election result. And just this past weekend, the Taliban negotiated a peace deal with the United States without input from the Afghan government. That deal has already begun to fray after a U.S. airstrike targeted Taliban fighters Wednesday after the militants attacked an Afghan security force outpost. Susannah George is the Afghanistan and Pakistan bureau chief for the Washington Post, and she joins me now from Kabul. Susannah, thank you very much for joining us. So this deal was being promoted as really a monumental breakthrough for peace. How is it almost a week later now?
Well, this deal really was designed to facilitate the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. It was not designed to bring violence levels down to zero across the country, certainly not violence levels between the Taliban and Afghan security forces. And so that's what we saw happen on Wednesday. While the U.S. and the Taliban signed this peace deal on Saturday, U.S. officials were adamant that they retained the right to defend themselves and their allies if the Taliban were to continue attacks against Afghan government forces. So what we saw happen on Wednesday is the Taliban fighters began an attack on an Afghan government checkpoint in Helmand in southern Afghanistan, and the U.S. responded with an airstrike. Surprisingly, that does not violate the terms of the peace deal because it is the U.S. defending their allies. But it just goes to show that while there may be this peace deal between the Taliban and the United States, violence levels in the country are actually spiking since the peace deal was signed.
So Afghans are seeing the brunt of the violence this week. Is this peace deal protecting the people of Afghanistan, or is this really about the American soldiers deployed there?
It really depends who you ask, whether what kind of an answer you're going to get to that question. What some people say is this is one step toward a larger peace deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban that could bring violence levels down to near zero. That's something that we saw in the week leading up to the signing of the peace deal. There was a reduction in violence agreement that reduced violence across the country by 80%. We spent a lot of time outside of Kabul during that time, and people were genuinely hopeful. They said, if violence can come down this far during a week, why can't it be like this all the time? So there are some people who believe that this is one step toward peace. There are others who say that this is the United States just protecting their own interests, facilitating the withdrawal of their own forces, and as one Afghan official told me, throwing us under the bus for a photo op and a handshake.
Wow. The Taliban and the Afghan government are scheduled to begin talks Tuesday. What's the goal here, and does it look like they'll get where they want to be at that point?
Yes, well, this was a very tight timeline that was explicitly laid out by the peace deal that was signed on Saturday. Right now, there's already been hiccups. I think it was just the day after the peace deal was signed that the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, said that one of the preconditions that was laid out in the U.S. Taliban peace deal, the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners, he said that that was not going to happen, and that actually was going to be something that was going to be discussed during the inter-Afghan dialogue. The Taliban then responded that if those prisoners were not released, they were not going to engage in the inter-Afghan dialogue at all. So right now, we do not know if that's even going to move forward, and if the two sides are going to meet on March 10th as the way that the peace deal laid out that they should.
So another point, Susannah, within this U.S. Taliban deal is really troop withdrawal. How many people could be pulled out of Afghanistan? You touched on that a bit. Are we any closer to ending this 18-year war?
Well, the peace deal does lay out very explicitly that it lays the roadmap for a complete U.S. troop withdrawal within 14 months. So that's bringing troop levels down to zero. That does have a certain number of conditions attached to it. When I've spoken to some senior Afghan security officials, they say that they believe that these conditions are so specific that the Taliban will never be able to meet them. And so the U.S. will never be able to fully withdraw from Afghanistan, or at least not within the coming years. One drawdown that we know is going to happen is the drawdown to 8,600. That's going to happen in the next 130 or so days. But that really just gets troop levels down to what they were when President Trump took office, before he sent additional troops to Afghanistan. So any drawdown beyond that 8,600 is really up in the air at this point, despite the fact that the peace deal laid out a timetable for the drawdown to zero.
And just yesterday, judges at the International Criminal Court authorized an investigation into war crimes that were potentially committed by Afghan government forces, the Taliban, even American troops. How significant is this, and what do you think could come out of this decision?
This is an incredibly significant decision because this is the first time that the International Criminal Court has taken up a case that involves U.S. troops. It also comes despite strong opposition from the Trump administration, not only to this case, but to the International Criminal Court in general. It's unclear at this point whether or not this case will yield results, because there is strong opposition from all parties that would be investigated in this case, from the United States, the Afghan government, and from the Taliban. So it's unclear if this case would make any headway, but just the fact that it has been green-lighted to proceed is a very, very big deal.
Susannah George, thank you so much for joining us, Susannah.
Thank you.